Now, on to the show.
Jim, isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that
Welcome to the 19-9 podcast. I'm excited today to talk about Georgetown basketball and specifically the 80s era, but we're going to bounce around to everything. And I've got John Reagan here. He is part of the Georgetown Basketball History Project. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks very much.
Hey, I'm going to start you off just asking about your basketball origin story. How did you get into the game, and then lead us into how you started out with the website?
Sure. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I'm a 1984 graduate of Georgetown. So I arrived at a precipitous time at the university relative to its basketball success. I was 2 years sports editor of the student newspaper there, the Hoya. So I got a lot of opportunity to follow the team firsthand. And over the years, maintained interest in the university and the programs. At the dawn of what are considered websites on the internet, which is the mid-90s, I began a website which provided daily coverage of Georgetown's basketball and football programs. And then from there, and that's still going on to this day, and in 2003 began essentially an archive site for statistics and information about the former players, which grew into what's now the Georgetown Basketball History Project. So that has continued for the last now 20 years, where readers can look up specific information about a player or a game or learn about any kind of statistics they want. There's some feature articles on the site. There's some articles on the context and the history of the program, but it provides an opportunity for people who want to learn more about a specific portion of the program over and above the daily type articles. That website is meant more for the history of what it accomplished over the years. In 2010, I was contacted by the university to help them write a history book about the program, which debuted in early 2010s, which was fairly successful. And it's allowed me to continue to take this knowledge and put it into a format that our readers in the both the web and the social media age can learn more about what the program has been and hopefully where it is headed.
That's really cool. It really comes off as like basketball reference for Georgetown specifically. So do you have did you always want to do a website about Georgetown or what was the genesis of that idea? Cause there aren't a lot of school specific ones out there, just with as much granularity as yours has.
I had collected statistical information over the years. I as a member of the booster club, they would send you every year the media guide. And so I collected those over the years. So I kind of had an idea of where trends were headed. And so I had an interest in kind of finding a place for all of this. And in the course of that research, I found things the university didn't have. For example, they did not have an all-time list of their former players. It just didn't exist. So I was able to go through, do the research, pull the articles from various sites, and create that all-time list. Or to create an all-time schedule that had dates in it, not just, okay, they played 12 schools and here they are. So it's a good resource for the university. It's also a good resource for the reader to say, what is it about this program that is both distinct as well as comparable to what other programs have done over the years. And because doesn't have, even though it was founded in 1907, it does not have that long track record of Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, and that group. So it's relatively short on the national exposure of college basketball, but it does have a long history that I think tells the story of how it got to where it got to, and in a way that is, I think, unique from many of the other schools that have made college basketball a priority over the years.
Well, that's a really cool detail that you mentioned graduating in 1984. So take us back. What was it like to be on campus during that era? What was the vibe? Because there is, I feel like, maybe people, you could even talk a little bit about getting into Georgetown and what the Georgetown student body is like as opposed to the basketball team, because there was this kind of push and pull between the two. And I think they embraced the basketball team as the rest of the country maybe tried to characterize them as villains a little bit.
Yeah. So, the Georgetown of the 80s was different than it was today. We were very loyal to the program. We felt like we were connected. When Georgetown went to the Final Four in 1982 in New Orleans, 2,000 students left for New Orleans on buses, on planes, on cars. Imagine a third of your student body just getting up and leaving to go to New Orleans. And that was what we did. I don't think you could get 2,000 Georgetown students to go anywhere today. But we really enjoyed what the basketball program meant to the university.
Those are the kids getting on the bus,
Yeah.
No,
So
no problem. It
was a 26-hour ride from Washington to New Orleans.
So were you one of those kids getting on the bus? All right.
Yes, it was.
That's amazing.
And we did take the trip to Seattle 2 years later.
Okay.
The university got us a plane, and I think that it was like $300 to get out there round trip,
wow.
plus lodging. So it was a good deal. But yes, we had to get our parents' permission for that, as opposed to getting on a bus, and didn't really cost as much. But when you travel that distance, you've got to pay for it. So
thinking about that, this historic lens that we're shining on this era, where did this? You talked about some of the sort of school-based structure, what the school was like. How in the world then did a nationally renowned basketball program generate out of those circumstances? That doesn't sound like the sort of milieu that you would want for to create the ideal basketball program, which it was throughout the 80s and into the 90s.
Well, a lot of it began let me get a little step back in terms of how Georgetown got to where it was. So for the first 80 years of Georgetown's athletics, it was a football school. Mm-hmm. It played major college football. It was in the Orange Bowl. It was in the Sun Bowl. It played a national schedule. It mostly played what would be today ACC schools. But it played Michigan State and Ole Miss and Tulsa and Miami. And the program was shut down in 1951 over finances. It was brought back in 1964, but it's at a much smaller level, which is now Division I AA or FCS football. So that never gets the attention that it would otherwise get as a major program. But at the point that John Thompson arrived at Georgetown in 1972, we essentially had three Division I men's sports: mm-hmm. basketball, track, and baseball. We had no women's sports. We had a handful of football was marginally funded. You had a couple other sports that kind of just hung on. Mm-hmm. And there was an interest at the time to say that this is a sport which could be more properly promoted, not only within the university itself, but within the city of Washington, D.C., which had gone through fundamental changes over the past 15 to 20 years prior to Thompson's arrival. John grew up in D.C. He was born there in 1941, with the exception of his 4 years at Providence College and his 2 years with the Boston Celtics. He lived his entire life within about a 7-mile radius of where he grew up. So Crazy. He knew everything. But he also knew that Georgetown as an institution had struggled for an identity in a changing world. In 1950, Washington, D.C. was 70% white. And within 20 years, it went to 70% African-American.
Wow, that's a real demographic shift.
The university itself had very much kept a closed-door policy to the city. People would be surprised to know that as late as 1970, Georgetown was an all-white basketball team.
Wow,
we did not recruit anybody locally. And that was less about race and more about the fact that they just didn't want to have kids coming in from places they weren't comfortable with. And so even if and there's stories on the website about this, but for example, there's a high school just north of Washington, just north of the campus, maybe 2 blocks away in the 50s, where one of the top players in the city was looking for college, and Georgetown didn't want him to come because he was white. But it's like, you didn't go to the right high school because you went to public high school. We only take kids from the local Catholic high school. So in a lot of ways, it was very insular. Mm-hmm. And the search committee really saw in Thompson an opportunity to take Georgetown beyond its gates, take it beyond its walls, and to really start to reintegrate itself with a city that it had always been part of, but it had retreated from over the years. And John's approach in terms of recruiting Washington, D.C. kids, and not the kids that were coming from essentially prior to 1972, for about 30 years, Georgetown's basketball recruits all came from a series of Catholic high schools in northern New Jersey and New York City. In some years, like 12 of the 13 scholarships were from 4 high schools out in New York. All very good Catholic high schools, boys schools. They were always about a 500 team. They were never very good. That's why you never hear from them. There was just as a historical aside, I looked this up, from 1948 to 1972, so 25 years of basketball. There were 32 Division I Catholic universities playing at that level. Over that 25 years, Georgetown ranked 31st. Wow. And the school that was 32nd dropped the sport. Okay. So it was very much
that's on the precipice then, yeah.
And John saw an opportunity to do better than that. And to do that, he needed to work with the university on 2 ways. Get kids that could come in and compete, but also get kids that could come in and graduate. Because there was still a concern. We don't want to be a place where people come and go. And that allowed him to get the kind of kids he wanted in, and to show that they could do the work in the classroom and elevate the program as well. He had his first NCAA tournament team in his 3rd season. He went to the Final Four in his 9th, and at the age of 43, won a national championship.
Yeah, you hit on that. I want to drill down into that 84 team because it's kind of the culmination of this arc. You mentioned 82, they're in the Final Four, they're back in the Final Four, they're in the Final Four. He just hasn't gotten over the hump. So I've got 2 questions. I want to start with what is the kind of temperature in the city? You mentioned like in the city, and I've been to DC a couple of times. I know where Georgetown is. It's kind of an interesting piece of the city too. So I'm curious how the rest of the city kind of embraced the team or the feeling of on campus of how the team was embraced. And then we can get to talking a little bit more about that team specifically.
So one of the changes they made after the 1980-81 season, because of the interest the city had for the team, and again, for the purpose of the conversation, Washington, D.C., again, was very much an African-American community with especially a lot of segregation in 3 of the 4 quadrants. It's a quadrant city. Georgetown is in the northwest quadrant, which was mostly white. The other 3 quadrants were mostly African-American. But they took an interest in Georgetown because kids from those high schools were coming there. But the gym itself sat 4,000. And so they made a move in 1981 to move their games from on-campus gymnasium to a place called Capitol Center, which was this big old 70s kind of arena in suburban Maryland along the Capitol Beltway that sat 19,000. So all those people that lived in eastern D.C. and in Prince George's, Maryland could now come to the games and support the team as opposed to finding their way through town and sitting in this 4,000-seat gym where the tickets were not available. So they saw Georgetown as an affirmation of what their kids could do at a big-time level, because in many cases, and this was even the case with Maryland before Lefty Driesell, Washington, D.C. never had a great college basketball program. So Maryland was not very good until the 60s. You never heard anything from George Washington or American or Howard. It really wasn't the kind of place like the Big Five was in Philadelphia, or Chicago had DePaul, or the city. So this was an opportunity to really have the people of DC support their own kids here at a school in the district with a coach who was very much a Washington man. He was not brought in from somewhere else, and he was DC. And so there was a lot of affinity with that, and the chance to see them, to travel with them. There, to this day, is still an older group of people that really followed that team, had nothing to do with the university. We're not alumni. We're not we had never gone through the program, but they followed the program because of its ties with the local kids that went through the program, that stayed in the area, and ultimately built the program that you see today.
That's really interesting. I wanted to ask then, zooming in on that 84 team, because it has gets characterized. There's this sort of character that develops around John Thompson. And of course, we're talking about kind of the Pioneers collection that we're releasing this month, and about Black excellence and the way that he defined, what it is to be a Black coach and the first Black coach to win a national championship. And I just wondered what the perception was, or how you guys felt about the perception that kind of developed in the media. You hear these phrases like Hoya paranoia, and they're getting heckled in sort of derogatory ways on the road. And I'm sure if you're traveling to these games, it's just a weird sense. I just kind of wanted to see what was your guys' perception of the team, and how did that maybe contradict with what was out there in the media at the time?
The media did a pivot on Georgetown somewhere around after the 82 Final Four. So Hoya paranoia was as a phrase, Hoya paranoia predated that. That was actually a phrase that was used by media people because that Georgetown felt they weren't getting enough coverage of all things. So it pivoted from Georgetown wants more coverage to Georgetown wants to hide. And to some degree, I think John Thompson was resigned to that. And in some cases, I think he just kind of played up on it. So, for example, in the 82 Final Four, New Orleans doesn't have a lot of hotels. And so rather than staying downtown, he had his team stay in Biloxi, Mississippi, which is about an hour east. Well, the stories began like John is hiding the team there in Mississippi while they should be in New Orleans. So it began to grow in the press that John was somewhat secretive about his players. He also had a rule at the time, which was kept for many years thereafter, where freshmen did not interview with reporters for their first semester of studies. And that was looked upon as, well, what do they have to hide? So this started a narrative in the press that John was overly protective of his players, that there was an element that as black players, they were not comfortable in front of the camera. And a number of reporters really keyed up on that, one of which was Curry Kirkpatrick of Sports Illustrated, who didn't get an interview in 1982 and spent the next 3 years really getting after the program as a result. But it led to a perception in the press that Georgetown was very good, but they were combative on the floor, that they were going to cause trouble. And yet this was markedly different from how they were on campus and how they were going to the games. John made it a point where when they arrived in a city or they came to the game, they were in coat and tie everywhere they went. It was yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. They didn't talk out of case. So he was playing against stereotype and wanted those guys to be very much professional in that sense around other teams. But the story of why they got that reputation is less about the times they were in. And we'll talk about some of the things they had to go through as players, specifically Patrick Ewing, and more about John's background as a high school and college player. John Thompson was very much influenced by Red Auerbach, both in high school as well as as a pro level. The Red Auerbach offense of the Celtics, going back to the 40s into the 50s and then into the 60s, was very much like what you saw in Georgetown in the 80s, which was very disciplined, very defensive-minded. The big man in the middle. It started with Ed McCauley in the early 50s, and then he was traded, so they got Bill Russell. Bill Russell took no crap from anybody, and in many ways, Ewing was his Bill Russell. John Thompson played 2 years at Boston as Russell's backup and got no time because Russell's approach was, I'm the star. Yeah. I'm playing 46 minutes a game, and if you can do better than that, you beat me out of it. But I'm not going to take a break 30 minutes in so that you can get time. Yeah. So I think he built a series that was very much like the Auerbach teams, which was they play 40 minutes, they never tire. He had them on physical training from the moment they got to the campus. They ran. And in doing so, they projected what Sports Illustrated on a cover once said, rough, tough, and terrific. And I think that there was a stereotype that if it was a school that the team at the time had 3 white players in 83 and then 2 graduated and 1 transferred, that the 83-84 team was the first all African-American team at a major college level outside of the historically black colleges. Right. So that also played to the fact that this was a more, in some quarters gruff and in some quarters more militant approach to basketball when it was anything but. I think it was John's way of saying, I want to do it my way. Yeah. And if we can win that way, that's up to you to decide how you want to view us. Yeah, let's go to Ewing first. And you mentioned his name, and obviously he is that man in the middle, and I feel like just represents a lot of things about Georgetown basketball. But you talked about some of the things that he had to go through. I don't know where you want to take that, but I think it's an interesting I talked to Jesse Washington, who wrote I Came as a Shadow, the book about John Thompson, and he talked a little bit of Bill Russell at San Francisco having to go down to Louisiana, where he's from, and just get mercilessly heckled, making, comments and throwing change at him and just crazy stuff that you can't even imagine sometimes. And I just was curious where you were going to go with the Ewing. So, Ewing started out, he was a very quiet person. I mean, people that know him, he's in front of people he knows, he's very comfortable. When he was in high school, he kind of kept to himself. He's from Jamaica. He didn't feel comfortable in the Boston area. He chooses Georgetown on February 4th of 81. And all of a sudden there were stories popping out from coaches that did not get him. One of which was Rick Pitino saying, well, I couldn't accept him at Boston University because he wanted untimed tests. And we're like, what? And Georgetown had no interest. Georgetown was not offering untimed tests. But it began a perception that Ewing wasn't as strong academically as he should be. Patrick graduated in 4 years with his Bachelor of Arts degree. So that was not a problem. He was not sent through an accelerated program at Georgetown, but it led to an approach that he was somehow not as smart as his other players.
Right.
In his sophomore year, he went to at least 2 games at Syracuse where in one game there were people throwing bananas onto the floor. Another one threw oranges. At one point, John Thompson went to the microphone and said, "If you keep, this has got to stop." And Jim Boeheim, always John's foil, walked up and said, "If this happens again, I'm forfeiting the game. Syracuse will forfeit this game if this happens again." And so you saw this out there. You saw signs that would be paraded around stadiums in a Villanova game. I remember this one where it said, "Raleigh's kids crush Thompson's thugs." And in the 80s, the word thug had a specific and defined meaning for black players.
Yeah.
You could not be a white person to be a thug. You were only a black person. And this was particularly discouraging to Thompson in as much as he went to Catholic high schools. He went to Providence College. He was familiar with all of these schools. And yet the very schools that should have been more culturally aware were the ones where the students were most likely to cause trouble for him. So this kept a sense that Georgetown was an outlier, and while they appreciated their success, there was, I think, a feeling of an us versus them that the press was quick to identify with the program. That somehow, because they were an all-black team and were getting this kind of treatment in certain markets, other markets not, but in certain markets that they would play in, lent to the fact that they kept very much to themselves, and yet that's where Hoya Paranoia became much more of a common phrase than it did 4 years earlier when it was still kind of a throwaway title for the sports information staff.
That's nuts. What about that? Were the players accessible on campus? I mean, like you mentioned, it's a small school. So, I know at IU, I would see players, walking through campus, or I had a couple in classes with me. So just curious if they were kind of out with the rest of the student population.
Yeah. I mean, Georgetown at the time was about 6,000 undergraduates. It's a 100-acre campus. So yes, you would see them around. You might see them in certain classes. I was in the business school. Most of the basketball players were either in liberal arts. For the most part, they were a couple were government majors, a couple were sociology. You had a couple in different places. So you would see them. They were not locked away. But the life of a scholarship athlete involves a lot of practice time.
Especially with John Thompson.
So they would do 20, 30 hours a week and whatever the NCAA limit was at the time. So that most of their time was spent at the gym as opposed to hanging out by the library or whatever. But they had to go to the lunchroom just like everybody else. They had to get to class. Patrick lived I had an apartment complex on campus, and I was on one side and he was on the other, right by the laundry. And when I went to see the laundry, you see him heading down to the gym. So yes, they were very much a part of the school itself. And I think that also lent to the fact that this was not some kind of hired group that came in and left, but that they were going through the same process. And that's why that push that John had all around about you will graduate if you stay 4 years was important. Not just for the recruits and their parents, but for the university to say, okay, we're bringing in kids that may not have a 1,300 on their SAT, but they will stay, they will graduate, and they will be productive people. So that was very much a story throughout his years that you will stay and graduate. Now, did everybody stay? No, there were kids that, for whatever reason, said, I can't do this anymore, and they left. But if you made it through 4 years, you were going to graduate, and that's one of the legacies that John left in the program was this understanding that you're here to get a degree and not just to play basketball.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit more about that 84 Final Four. You mentioned getting out there to it. What stands out the most about that Kentucky game? Because I think the matchup between Akeem and the championship, I think probably gets maybe the most press or the most remembrance. But that like you said, that Final Four game is just an incredible watch. If you ever get lately as an IU fan, you get a little sad sometimes about the teams more recently. I'll go watch a 1987 championship or Final Four and really feel the joy come back.
I was there in '87 for the IU Syracuse final. It was a remarkable game.
Nice.
Now this was also a great period for IU. Remember, '81 they were in the Final Four. I think they lost to North Carolina one of the following years. So Georgetown gets through the West Regional. It was their second time in the West, so that they got through it. They beat Dayton at one point, to get to the new UNLV and Dayton to get to the finals, and they're facing number 3 Kentucky, which was known at the time for having 2 centers. Sam Bowie, who was arguably the second best center in the country behind Ralph Sampson, and a 6'10" guy by the name of Melvin Turpin.
Yeah.
So Kentucky was a really,
Both guys
really good team.
went to the pros too. Mel Turpin went to the pros too.
So they also had a guard by the name of Dickie Beal, who was didn't play as much in the pros, but he was a great college guard. And so Kentucky was a formidable opponent. That game was played at the King Dome was torn down about 20 years ago, but it was a big old concrete stadium, sat like 50,000.
Yeah.
And that was the second game on the docket that afternoon before it followed the Houston Virginia game, which was won by Houston in their third consecutive Final Four.
Yep.
So Georgetown's playing Kentucky. Ewing gets into early foul trouble. Kentucky's up 27-12 with 8 minutes to go. And people are like, oh, this is not going to end well because Kentucky is a team that really plays up to it. John's approach at the time was, don't worry, we'll get Patrick back for the second half. Just play better defense. Okay? So 27-15, Georgetown scores the last 7 points of the first half. Now, again, for your audience, realize there's no three-point play, there's no shot clock. So 27-22 is not unusual. It's a little bit slow, but that's your halftime score. The second half opens with something that is remarkable in that it has never happened since in college basketball. Kentucky, this is a very good Kentucky team, one of the best offenses in the country, does not score for the first 10 minutes of the second half.
Wow.
They missed their first 10 shots of the second half, and at that point, Georgetown had taken the lead. They proceeded to shoot 3 for 33 in the second half, 9%. Okay, and lose the game 53-40. So they scored 13 points in the second half, 6 by field goal and 7 by free throw.
Wow.
And Joe B. Hall could not understand it. I remember seeing him after the game walk through a hallway, and he had this look on his face like, what just happened? I mean, you're the number 3 in the team in the country. You've got at least 2 NBA draft picks on your team, and you proceed to miss 30 of 33 shots.
Crazy.
And a lot of it was Georgetown's defense, just forcing them to take bad shots. And 33 shots in 20 minutes is not unusual for the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't bad shots. It wasn't like they were taking 35-foot shots. They missed layups. They missed close ins. They were so rattled by the defensive efforts that Georgetown had provided. And you could just see the confidence drain out of them. You go 10 minutes without a basket, then they score, then they go another 7 minutes without a basket. So literally entering the final 4 minutes of that game, they had 2 field goals in the second half. And with that, Georgetown wins the game by 13 and goes on to play Houston in a game which was relatively close. Georgetown was leading throughout most of the game, but that Kentucky game opened a lot of eyes to, wow, what a defensive stop that was against a team that had really overwhelmed its opponents in the tournament. And if you look back upon how Kentucky did leading up to that, they manhandled a lot of their teams. So they're up 12 on Georgetown late in the first half, and all of a sudden it's halftime, and they flatline.
Just suffocated.
And you really do not see that certainly not in today's basketball, but they shot 9% in the second half.
That is crazy.
And that's a lot. I mean, that is defense. That is not Kentucky wasn't playing well. Kentucky lost its that was defensive stops up and down the court.
So what was it like watching Ewing go up against Hakeem at the time? Because I think that they had this legendary battle then in the pros too, and a lot of people might know about that. But the fact that they went up against each other in college I think is so fascinating to think about, because they just became 2 of the all-time greats, and it rarely plays out that way. That that great also translates into all-time great in the pros.
Just my opinion as a fan. I think Olajuwon became a better player in the pros than he was in college. He was more of a project player at Houston. I think that's part of that is because of the way that team was run. There's an excellent documentary that ESPN did about the '83 Phi Slamma Jamma team, and how Benny Anders, and if you've seen that one pass, if it's deflected, how everything changes for that program. But they were coming into their third Final Four. They came so close the year before. I think there was a feeling on that team that they just couldn't get over the hill. Yeah. Ewing was the better man that night. Olajuwon had to do a lot. He was frustrated by a bigger man inside. And a lot of the Houston offenses that time did not roll through Olajuwon. For example, Clyde Drexler earlier, he was the guy that moved it along. So Olajuwon is still growing into the kind of player he could be. But this is just me talking. It's not necessarily fact. I just when I looked at them, I saw that he was very much an important part, but he was not the player on that team the way he could have been if Guy Lewis had really made him the focal point. Now, people can disagree. I understand that. But in that game, I think Ewing basically played him to, at worst, a draw and had the better of him. Georgetown got a great performance out of a little-known freshman by the name of Michael Graham in that game. Opened up that game. Graham we could
do a whole other podcast on him.
Yeah, I mean, he averaged 5 points a game. Was never disqualified for a game. People had this idea he was this complete, troublemaker, and he was never that. But yes, he's a whole other story. He had a great game in that final. Also, Reggie Williams, the freshman, was the player of the game. But I think Ewing was a better player that day. As Ewing went on to the Knicks and as Olajuwon went on to the Rockets, I think Olajuwon really built up his ability to own the floor in ways he did not in college.
So after they win, what is the perception then? How does it change? Because it seems like eventually the sort of perception of Thompson, the program, everything has this kind of shift where he becomes this kind of almost grandfatherly figure, the way that he's embraced and thought about. And certainly it's deserved. I just think that it's so interesting, to have this almost villainous storyline written about you, and then to just do what you've always been doing and have it totally turn around into almost the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that's the kind of the arc of his coaching, that he was not well known when he got the job. He was a high school coach. He had never coached in college.
That's so crazy.
He takes the job. It was $20,000 a year. John was a capitalist. He used to say that the world was not black and white, but shades of green. And so it was important to him to, make money. Georgetown could not really pay him a lot. And so that's where the alliance with Nike allowed him the ability to build up his wealth in ways that Georgetown could not. And yet he was someone who was really taught at a very early age to make sure that you stood up for yourselves. And so he would not back down for those who might question what he was doing. There were times where he would get in his own way sometimes. There were a number of great players where he would not recruit them because, well, I'll give you an example. Kenny Anderson, who NBA, wanted to come to Georgetown. John Thompson would not visit Kenny Anderson's house. He says, I don't go to recruits' houses. You want to come to talk to me? Come to the campus.
Interesting.
And so, guess what? Kenny Anderson goes elsewhere.
Yeah.
Georgetown lost Grant Hill. It lost Dennis Scott, Rasheed Wallace, because John said, "Look, this is how I recruit.
Yeah.
You want to do it this way? You come and talk to me. But if you don't, go somewhere else."
Very interesting.
So that lost him the opportunity in the 90s. I mean, where is this team in the 90s with a lineup that included Dennis Scott, Kenny Anderson, Alonzo Mourning, Dikembe Mutombo, and Grant Hill?
Sounds like a good lineup.
Yeah. So it did not happen. The Mutombo story was he was alerted to Mutombo through a member of the U.S. International Aid Group that says, "Hey, there's a kid down here. You need to." John's not flying to the Congo to see him. He says, "Is he good? Yes. Is he tall? Yes. Well, let's talk. I want to find out more about him." And brought him to the U.S. Under a chance to. He did not play his first year. He came to school and basically was in the classroom for the first year, in part because in his country they didn't offer the SATs.
Oh wow!
So he could speak 4 languages, but the SAT was not offered there. So things like that added to the perception that John always kind of had these secret recruits out there somewhere.
Right.
So I think he did not dissuade those people who wanted to take a prejudiced view of him, because it did not matter to him. What mattered to him was that he was standing up for what he believed in, and in doing so was successful at it.
It's so crazy. I mean, what an amazing run in the 80s and even on into the 90s. Like you said, I just kind of astounded by what he built there, and the
I mean, their overall record in the 80s was 268 and 69.
It's just crazy.
So if you do the math on that, I mean, they won 6 Big East titles. They had gone to 3 Final Fours, narrowly missed the 87 Final Four with Providence College, narrowly missed the 89 Final Four on Duke. they came very close. Even the year before Ewing got there in 1980, it's a forgotten one. Georgetown won the inaugural Big East title. They beat Maryland in the regional semifinals, which Maryland's was ranked number 4 in the country. Yeah. They play Iowa in the regional final, lead by 15 at the half, lose on a 3-point play with 5 seconds to go, and did not make the Final Four. So as the longtime radio voice of the Georgetown program, Rich Shavatkin, would say, there's been a lot of great moments, but a lot of heartbreaks along the way.
Yeah.
And so he saw them all, and John saw them all. But I think, John got to a point where he saw that the college basketball landscape was changing. So he resigns in 1999, essentially at the age of 58, and did what many coaches could not do, which was enjoy the life of an elder statesman. And so many coaches want to hang on and hang on and hang on more. And there is something to be said for that coach that walks away and still is connected to the game. John was a radio announcer for many years in the Washington area, which is the amusing part was he hated the press, didn't he? No, he's a radio. He hosted an afternoon radio show. He did Westwood 1 college basketball games with Bill Rafter, who he had played against in college. Rafter was a great forward at LaSalle in the 60s.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And so he did that, and he was able to kind of stay around in the game, much like, Rafter left Seton Hall at the age of 39.
Right, yeah.
And has enjoyed this great career. But a lot of guys don't want to do that. They want to stay into their 60s and 70s. He didn't want to do that. And so it allowed him 20 years to kind of do what he wanted in life. And the Washington book is interesting because I think in his later years, he saw where things were headed. He had mobility issues at the time, and he wasn't getting around as much. And he wanted to have a book that would tell his story the way he wanted to be told. 20 years earlier, he was going to do a book, an autobiography with a gentleman by the name of Ralph Wiley. Okay. And if your readers or your viewers don't know about Ralph Wiley, look him up. He was a remarkable reporter for Sports Illustrated. Okay. He was a great reporter. He died young in 2004. But John saw the final version of the book and said, I don't want this book. And they were stuck. They had done the whole book, and he says, I don't want it. And so the book was never published. So he goes to Jesse Washington in 2016, 2017 and says, let me tell you my story. It is the story of John Thompson, the way John Thompson wanted it to be said. There's a lot in that book. There's a lot not in that book. He doesn't talk about his wife, his kids, why he did certain things. It was just kind of setting the case for why he did what he did. So it's an autobiography, but it's also an unusual one in that there's no book tour. There's no appearances on TV to talk about it, no questions and answers. He died 3 months before it was published. And I think he wanted to go out with his version of the story. And it's got a lot of good things in it. It talks more about civil rights and those issues than probably he did as a coach, but that he still had an opinion on. But again, it's the final word, because who's going to argue? Who's going to write a book that's going to go contrary to what John said about himself? So that becomes kind of the last book on Thompson. There's 4 books that have been written about the program, but I don't think there'll be one on Thompson going forward, because you run into the fact that, well, he's already written the book. But he chose his subjects carefully. There's a few things in that book that I never knew about as a fan or as a writer, but they're few and far between. Many of the stories he told had been told in other media, but I think he wanted, as he said in the book, to tell the story to his grandkids.
Yeah, that's great. Well, tell us where people can find more information about you, and then if you got another book recommendation too on Georgetown, I'm always looking for stuff to read. So the
website is www.hoyabasketball.com. That's the historical archive. The daily coverage of Georgetown basketball is at Hoyasaxa, HOYASAXA.com, which is the college cheer, and that's updated daily.
I wonder what that was.
Yeah, so think of it much like the Virginia Tech Hokie cheer, or
I got it now.
The very rock chalk, whatever the case may be. So Hoyasaxa.com for the daily coverage, and Hoyabasketball.com for the archive coverage. And if readers have an opportunity to learn more about that, what Georgetown basketball was like in the 80s and 90s, and they can find it on Amazon or other places. There's a book by former Washington Post reporter Leonard Shapiro called Big Man on Campus, which is very fair, but also points into things that John did that probably didn't make it to the Jesse Washington book. When Henry Holt was the publisher, wanted to take an ad out in the Game Time program Georgetown would not accept the ad. They hadn't even seen the book, but they didn't even want to let people know the book existed.
Interesting.
And it was published in 1991.
Okay.
And yet it, like I said, it was a tough but fair view of this. And Shapiro had known Thompson back since high school, since he was coaching high school ball. And so that's always a good opportunity to kind of read about a reporter's view of how John ran the program.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's not disparaging,
right? But
it also paints a fair view of what he was like. And there are those who, worshipped him, and there were other people in his community that thought he was, we don't want anything to do with him. It was that dichotomy of who he was that made him such a fascinating person, both as a coach and a phrase that he liked to use in university company, that he was more than a coach. He'd like to say, I'm an educator.
Yeah.
And all of that entailed.
For sure. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. And, I hope that if we get into the 90s, one of these times we'll get you back on, talk a little bit more about that kind of Morning Mutombo, Iverson era of the program as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for listening to the 19-9 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 19-9 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time.